So in this video we're going to create a quiz by only using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. So there will be no database that the quiz is linked up to. Everything will be handled in the browser. If you want the questions to come from a database, you could still follow this video and then integrate a database yourself, or else I might also make a video about that. But first of all, the only file that we need is a index.html file. So I already have this project folder where I'm just going to add a new file, and we're inside Visual Studio Code. So let's add a new file. Let's call it index.html. And if we type an exclamation mark and just hit enter, then we get a template for a very simple HTML file so that we don't have to write this ourselves. Before I start typing, I will say that I have all the code in my blog. You can just go and copy and paste it. But in this video, I will explain a little bit in depth what it's going to do. But before we put something into the body, I just want to insert a link in our head so that we can use Bootstrap. So I'll just make a new line and then insert this link that is going to include Bootstrap in our project. You don't have to use Bootstrap. This is just because it looks prettier than just simple HTML. So let's go and say that this is a quiz. And the first thing we will do is to add a new div that can contain our quiz. I will give it an ID of quiz. And just to make it look prettier, I will include the class of a container. This is from Bootstrap. This is just to center it a little bit more. And then we will go and say that it should have some padding at the top. And when you're using padding, you can use the values between 1 and 5. So I'll just say 5, where 5 is the most padding that you can get. So inside this container, I want to make a new div to contain our first question and also to contain the 3 values we can choose from, or the 3 answers. So let's go and say that this have an ID of question 1. And then we also make a class for this that is just called question. And I just saved the file. So the first thing we will have inside our first question is just going to be a paragraph that contains the question. And for this, I want to give it a class. And this is also a Bootstrap class that is called display. And we give it a value of 6. This is the smallest headline you can use. So just give it another font that looks nice and another size. And let's say that the first question is, what is the capital of France? So if we just save the file and try to look at how this page looks now, then I will go up to my index.html, right click it, say reveal in File Explorer, and then just double click the file. And now you can see we have the text, what is the capital of France? And then we want to add some answers that we can choose between. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And what I want to do is to add a label. And this will have a class of lead. And that is also just a Bootstrap class that we're going to use. It just make the paragraph stand out a little bit and it just make it look prettier. But let's go and add a input field. And actually just let's go and add the text. So what the first answer should be, and we will just say Paris. So now inside our label, we do have a input tag that we're going to put some attributes on. So it's going to be a radio button. And then we have the first value, which is Paris. So inside the input, I want to add a new class. And this is also just to make it look a little bit better. So we say margin. And we want to just add the value of 2. So just a little bit of margin that will go around the radio button. Then we want to specify what type this input is. And this is a radio button. And then we want to give it a name. So we say name. And this will be the question 0. And the reason that it's 0 and it's not 1 is because we're just going to loop through all the questions from a for loop where we just start at 0. You can also go and make it 1, but then we just have to make the for loop run from 1. And finally, we want to say what value do this radio button have? And in question number 0, this should be the first option. So we say option 1. And I'll just drag this a little bit so we have more space. So from here on, it's a little bit easier now because we have all the base code. If we just save this and we go to our website again and we update it, then you can see we now have the first option, which is Paris. So let's go back and add the next two answers that we can choose from. So I'll just hit Control C, Control V and do it twice. So now the only thing we have to change here is that this is option 2 and this is option 3. And of course we want to add some different values. So let's say this is Berlin and this one is Rome. So let's try and go back and see how this looks. We save the file, go to our quiz, update the window, and now we can see we have all the answers that we can choose from, but I actually want to have it on a separate line. So if we just go back to Visual Studio Code, then just at the end of these labels we're going to make a break just like this and save it, and let's go back again and see. So now we have it on separate lines. So let's go and make some more questions. This should be easy because we can just copy and paste this whole section. So just copy and then go under and say paste, and let's do it twice. What we then need to do is to say that this is not question 1, this is question 2, and in our name it will be question 1. And also down here at the ID we will say that this is number 3 and the question here is number 2. And for the second question I want to say what is the currency of Japan. We can then go to the side and say, is it the euro, is it yen, or is it the dollar? And then the last question, I will say what is the tallest mountain in the world? And then I just copy and pasted some answers to that question. So the final thing we have to do in our questions container is to add a button and then also a placeholder for the result. So under the last question, I want to make a new button. And again, this should have a class, which is some bootstrap classes that makes it look better. So first of all, we want to say this is a button and what type of button this is. This is going to be a primary, and then we will make some margin at the top. So just remember, you really don't have to understand bootstrap. This is simply just to make it look better in this project. I then want to say that this should have an ID and it should be called check answers. And then we will say what is the text inside the button. That would be check answers. So the last tag that we want to create in our HTML is going to be this div, and it should have no value inside, but it should contain an ID of results, and then we will give it some class values, and it will be the value of alert. This is again a bootstrap class, and we will say alert primary and then some margin at the top. We also want to say that it should have a role of alert. And again, this is also just some bootstrap. So now let's try and see how this looks in the browser. So we have all our 3 questions where we can choose an answer to each question. And then we can check it with this button. Of course, it doesn't do anything right now. We have to do that in JavaScript. And we also want to hide this box where it will display what the result of our quiz was, because we only want that displayed when you actually have some results from our quiz. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And after our body, we want to include a script. And from now on, I will just copy and paste some of the code, but explain to you what it's going to do. So on the first line, we get the quiz element on our page. We get the element by the ID of quiz. So the quiz variable are going to contain our whole container for the quiz and all the questions and all the answers. Then next we have the result container, which is going to take the element by ID of results. So it will contain the results. So we're going to use the result container to actually display some HTML inside to say what the result is going to be. And finally we have the submit button, which is going to listen to our check answers ID element, which is the button we created up here. So we say the ID is check answers, and that is the element that's going to be saved inside our submit button. But before we do anything, I just want to hide the results container so that it will be displayed as none. So if we save the file now and we go to the browser and update the view, you can see that it now do not display the container where we're going to display the results. But let's go back again. So now I just copy and pasted the questions so that we have all the questions and the answers inside our JavaScript. And then it will also have a value of what the correct answer is. And in this case, it's option number 1. So what is the capital of France? It is Paris. And all this is just a list. If you take one element at a time, you can see that this is one question, and then we have another question, and it's all inside our array. So when you create this list also, you have a better way to handle it in JavaScript. But if you scroll down and just make a couple of more lines, then the last thing we have to do is to say on our submit button that we want to add a event listener. And this is a click event listener. And when it's going to be clicked, we want to run this method called show results. And that's actually the last part we need to do now, is to create this show results. So now I just created our method. It's not going to take any parameters. But inside our show results, we want to add a variable called numCorrect. And what this will do is just to count how many answers that we get correct in our quiz. So the next thing we will do is to loop through all our questions in a for loop. And this was just what I meant by we want to start at 0. So we start this for loop at 0. And that's why we call the first question here for 0. And the first thing we will do inside our for loop is just to save the questions index inside our question variable, so that the question we're looking at right now is going to be saved in questions. We have to remember this questions is coming from the JSON array that we created in here, where we say questions, and then it will target. In this case, it will be the 0 at first. So index 0 will be the first question that we have, just like we say question 0 up here. And that's why we can compare them now. So if we go down to our for loop again, then we can go and say inside our quiz, we can go and use this query selector. So inside we actually just say what name do we want to target. And in our case, it was question. And then we display the 0 if the index is 0. So if we just think about that, we have the first for loop that we're going through, then it will take the question that is indexed at the 0 from our JSON string, so it will save it here, and then it will also go inside our quiz element, and then we can say query selector, where it will target the name where the question is question 0 and where it's checked. So by doing this, it will go and see up in our answers here that if one of these question 0s is checked, then it will take the input field and put it as an element inside that variable. So we will get that element in here if one of the answers is checked. But first of all, we just want to make sure that it is checked. So if it's not checked, if it doesn't have any value, then we have to display, please select an answer for all questions. And this will just be an alert. And when it has displayed the alert, it will just return and jump out of the code. But if it have a value, then this will not execute. So it will just jump further down. And then we can say inside our answers container, please take the value, and then we get the value in here at the answer variable. And finally, we say if the answer is equal to the question's correct answer. So just to cut this down, this is the answer that we have chosen from the answers, so the input from the user. And this is actually going to take the answer from our JSON string and then go and fetch the correct answer from that string. So if we scroll up again, you can see that the value, if we click on the Paris value in this case, then the value we will get returned is option 1 on this question. And if we scroll down to our JSON string here, we can see that the correct answer from the first question is going to be option 1. So that would be the same as if we clicked on Paris, and that is the two value that is going to compare down here. And if the answer is equal to the correct answer, then we will count our numCorrect up with just 1, because then we have 1 right answer. So after the for loop, where it have checked all the questions, then we can go and say that you got and how many answers you got right out of the length of how many questions that there are. And then finally we say correct. And that string we want to put into our results container and put it as a HTML. And the final thing we have to do is to say that it should display the results as block. Because as you might remember, we just say in the beginning here that it should not display at all. But when we actually have a result to display, then just go and display it as a block. So let's try to save this and go to our browser. Then we want to update this window. It should look like the same because it was just JavaScript that we created since we visited this last time. So let's try and say, what is the capital of France? It is Paris. What is the currency of Japan? It is yen, but in this case I'll just say euro, to get one answer incorrect. And then also what is the tallest mountain in the world. We can say Mount Everest, and then check the answers. And then you can see we got 2 of 3 correct. So when you make the quiz, you can of course just go and add some more questions to this JSON array, and then remember to make the actual question on the HTML page. The only thing you have to change is the question ID and then the name inside. And of course the question container doesn't have to take up so much space as it does right now. You could use it at the bottom of a page if you have like a lot of informational text where you have some students that have to learn something, and then in the bottom they could take a quiz. But it is pretty easy to implement, and of course, as I said before, you can just go and get this from my website. I will link it in the description. I think that was all for this project. So just have a nice day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.